Today we're going to be in Ephesians 6 and talking about what looks like a controversial subject, but it's really not that controversial at all if you contextualize it. We're going to talk about slaves and masters, and in Paul's day that was very, very normal. It was understood that that was part of their lives in the Roman world as Jews, and they understood that there were going to be masters and there were going to be slaves. And so it's interesting here that Paul doesn't call slavery wrong here, but instead he gives instructions to both the master and the slave. Now in our society today, slavery is really not an issue. We have struggled with that issue and God has delivered us from that. But today where we could look at this is in the context of employees and employers. Let me read these verses to you, verses 5 through 9 of chapter 6 of Ephesians. He says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him." Now, the first thing he wants them to understand, both masters and slaves, and that is, you have a greater master, and that is Christ. The slaves obey their master because they want to honor Christ. The masters treat their slaves or their servants with honor and respect because they want to honor and respect God. Now, you move that into our context today, and you've got employers and employees. If you find yourself working for another person, he says this, do your work heartily as unto the Lord and not unto man. And don't do it for eye service or as a people pleaser. In other words, your work ethic should not change whether your boss is or is not around, because your ultimate boss is always looking, and that is God. And then he says to the masters, listen, I want you to treat them with respect. Don't threaten them. Don't constantly say, if you don't do this, then I won't do that. But instead, treat them with the respect that you have received from God. God in his grace and mercy saved us when we were rebels, when we were outcasts, when we were threatening him, when we were living in our sin, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We need to extend that kind of love in the workplace so that as believers, when we come in and we interview for a job and it becomes apparent that we're a believer, those that are hiring should want to hire us because our work ethic is strong and our desire to please is great because we want to please God. But masters, business owners, bosses, understand this. You're going to answer to God. Treat people with respect.